The carriages came up the lane in a procession that Cecily Hartwell had not permitted herself to imagine, even though she had known, since the solicitor's letter arrived 3 weeks prior, that this morning would come. She stood in the doorway of Ashmore Inn, with the inn's ledger tucked under her left arm, and the autumn light falling across the stone forecourt in long bands of pale gold. She wore her proprietress's dark blue wool, her hair dressed simply beneath a plain cap, her hands ungloved, because she had been tallying accounts when the first carriage was heard on the gravel. The forecourt was her ground. The inn itself, every beam and hearthstone and glass jar behind the bar, belonged to her by deed and by the 3 years of labor that had made it worth owning. She had forgotten, she told herself, nothing about how this morning would feel. She had simply never permitted herself to know. The lead carriage bore a crest she recognized before she could have said why. A falcon above a quartered shield, the livery of deep burgundy with silver fittings. She had seen it once, on the night a man pressed a folded paper into her hand and told her he would be back before the evening meal. The falcon crest. The silver fittings. The coach that had departed the inn at Ashmore 3 years ago and had not returned. He had not returned. The carriage drew to a halt not 15 feet from where she stood. Cecily did not step back. She did not arrange her expression. She was proprietress of Ashmore Inn, and the party, booking the great room for the next 3 days, had paid their deposit in full, and that was the sum of what this morning required of her. The footman opened the door. She had told herself she would not look directly at whoever descended. She looked. He was exactly as she remembered, and entirely altered. Taller than she had somehow reconstructed in memory. Or perhaps it was the traveling coat's broad shoulders that made the impression. Dark hair. The same severity of feature at brow and jaw. The same quality of stillness that had once made her believe, foolishly, that a man who moved like that must feel everything with equal precision. He stepped down from the carriage and turned toward the inn's facade, taking inventory the way a man of his station took inventory of all things, briefly, systematically, with no visible evidence of opinion. And then his eyes found her. The stillness that followed was not composure. It was something older and more involuntary than composure. It was the body arresting itself before the mind could issue the command. 3 years had done its work on her too. She hoped it showed. If you have ever watched 2 people recognize one another across a public distance they cannot close, you know the particular quality of that silence. Stay a little longer, and you will see whether recognition becomes reckoning. The carriages continued to arrive. The forecourt filled with servants and luggage and the younger members of the wedding party exclaiming at the autumn foliage that had turned the elms along the lane to copper and amber. Cecily Hartwell stood in her doorway and did not move, and Arthur Vane, Viscount Vane, stood in the forecourt of the inn she owned and did not look away from her. Then he did. He turned toward the luggage being unloaded, spoke a word to his steward, and walked in through the side entrance without crossing to the main door, where she stood. Cecily breathed once, through her nose. She turned back into the inn and went to greet the first of the guests. She had learned composure the hard way. In this place, in this same building, 3 years before. It had begun on a Tuesday morning in October. Cecily had been 21 years old and had been Mrs. Arthur Vane, by the grace of a quietly conducted ceremony in the village of Frome, for exactly 11 days. They had come north by post-chaise toward his estate, stopping at Ashmore Inn because the autumn roads had turned treacherous with rain, and the horses needed rest. She had not yet been presented to his family. The marriage was to be disclosed. Arthur had said once they arrived. Once it was unambiguously a fact, his mother could not overturn by argument or arrangement. He had smiled when he said it, the particular smile she had catalogued from their first meeting at her cousin's dinner party. The one that arrived without warning and softened everything about his face for just a moment before discipline reclaimed it. She had woken on the Wednesday morning to an empty room. There had been a letter on the small desk by the window. She had reached it in her nightgown, her feet cold on the flagstone floor, and she had read it in the gray morning light until the words resolved into something her mind refused to accept. The letter was in Arthur's hand. It said that he had made an error of judgment. It said that the marriage could not stand against what his family required of him. It said, with a courtesy that was its own species of cruelty, that he wished her well and had left funds with the innkeeper to see her safely home. She had sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. She had not gone home. There was no home to go to. Her father had died the previous spring, the house let to creditors, her cousin's charity already stretched thin by 3 daughters of their own to establish. She had nowhere to be safely conveyed. She had instead gone downstairs very quietly and found Mr. Pemberton the innkeeper in his kitchen, and she had asked if there was work she might do. Mr. Pemberton was a widower of 63, deliberate and unhurried in all things. He had looked at her for a long moment, at the plain dark dress she had changed into, at her hands that had been educated into uselessness and were now about to learn otherwise. He had given her an apron and set her to work. She had written to Arthur once, 4 months after the abandonment, when she had gathered sufficient composure to put the question plainly, whether the marriage stood at law, and if not, by what instrument it had been dissolved, and whether she was to understand herself as a widow or a wife, or something the law had no name for. The letter had been returned unopened, with a notation in a hand. She did not recognize that the address was incorrect. She had not written again. 2 years after she arrived, Mr. Bree. Pemberton took ill in November and worsened through the winter. He had no children. He had made his will, he told her, in the early autumn when he first felt the heaviness in his chest, and she was not to be surprised by what it said. She was surprised nonetheless. She had wept at his grave, in the village churchyard in March, the ground still cold underfoot, and she had returned to Ashmore Inn and taken inventory of everything she owned. The booking had come in July. Lord Vane's solicitor's letter, inquiring after the availability of the inn for a wedding party of 40 guests at the end of October, requesting the great room and all available bedchambers, offering a sum that would carry the inn's expenses through the following winter without difficulty. Her housekeeper, Mrs. Frame, had brought the letter to her in the garden, where she was overseeing the repair of the kitchen garden wall. Cecily had read it twice. She had told Mrs. Frame to confirm the booking. She had not spent the intervening months in grief or anticipation. She had repainted the inn's sign, taken on 2 new ostlers, ordered new linen for the upstairs bedchambers, and gone about the work of each day with the methodical attention that had carried her through everything else. If she thought of him at all, she thought of him precisely. A man who had held her hands in a village church at the age of 28 and spoken a vow he had not kept. She did not permit the thought to extend further than that. What she was left with, after 3 years, was not grief so much as a specific refusal to understand. She had never understood how a man could smile the way he smiled and then write that letter. Now he was in her inn. By the time the arrivals were settled and the senior guests shown to their rooms and the wedding party's requirements tallied by Mrs. Frame, it was past 2 in the afternoon. Cecily was in the small office behind the kitchen passage, writing up the revised supper requirements, when she heard the step in the passage that she recognized before she could have explained how she recognized it. She looked up. He stood in the doorway of the office, his traveling coat exchanged for a dark coat and clean linen, his hat in his hands. He looked at her, the way a man looks at something he has long ago decided does not exist. And then he looked at her. She waited. "I did not know," he said, "that you were the proprietress." "Your solicitor was thorough in his correspondence," Cecily said. "He did not ask the proprietress's name." A silence. He turned his hat between his hands once, a gesture so small and so unlike him that she noticed it with unwilling attention. Something had moved in his face at the sight of her 3 hours ago in the forecourt that had not entirely settled. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said. "Shall I have supper set for your party at 7? Or would 8 suit better?" He looked at the ledger in front of her. He looked at the office around her, the rows of account books on their shelf, the keys on their board by the door, the inn-bell's cord running through the wall. He looked at her in her plain dark wool with no ornamentation and no apology. 8, he said after a moment. He left. She sat for a time without writing anything, her pen held over the page. She had not seen him again until he appeared in the stable yard at 4:30, which she learned about only afterward from the account of her senior ostler, Tom Ridley. Tom told her when he came in for the evening tally that there had been a dispute in the stable yard in the mid-afternoon, a quarrel between two of the inn's grooms over the allocation of stall space now that the wedding party's horses had arrived. The quarrel had grown heated. He had gone to find her, but she had been occupied in the linen press, so he had sent a boy. She had come out to the stable yard in her working dress, apron still on, and sorted the matter in 12 minutes. The stall assignments were redistributed on a clear principle, the two grooms required to repeat the arrangement back to her and confirm they understood it. The boy sent for water for the horses that had been neglected in the commotion. Tom Ridley said she had not raised her voice and had not made either man feel small. Which, he observed, was harder than it sounded. She had not known, until Tom told her this, that Arthur had been standing at the upper gallery window of the inn's first floor throughout the entire exchange. He had not moved. He had not come down to assist or intercede. He had simply watched her manage what required managing. And then he had stood at the window for another moment after she returned inside. And then he had gone. She sat with that information for longer than she meant to. She thought of him the way she had trained herself not to think of him with her full attention, a man who had watched her work and had not looked away. Then she wrote, very carefully, 8 o'clock, and continued. He came to the office again at 6. She heard the step in the passage, this time, and set her pen down and composed herself before the knock, though composed was not quite the right word for what she managed. "Eat something before the morning runs away," he said when she opened the door. "You have not stopped since we arrived." His voice was the same in its register, level, quiet, carrying the assumption of being heard without requiring volume, and utterly different in some texture she could not name. She had remembered it as cold. She heard now that it was controlled. She heard the difference. "I am quite capable of managing my own meals," she said. "I know you are," he said. It did not sound like agreement. It sounded like the first line of a longer speech he had not yet authorized himself to give. Viscount Vane. She used the title deliberately, the formal distance of it a thing she needed between them. "You are here, as a guest, of this house. I am the proprietress of it. It would be easier for both of us if that arrangement were observed." He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was the same, the line of it, the particular tension that had always lived there. "There is something I require you to understand," he said. "I am listening. I received a letter," he said, "in November, 3 years ago. From you." The words landed strangely. She stood very still. "That is impossible," she said. "I did not write to you in November." His hand moved to his breast pocket. He produced a folded paper, worn at the creases, and held it out to her. She took it. She read it, standing in her doorway, her eyes moving carefully over the handwriting. The handwriting was a passable imitation of hers. It had her name at the bottom. It said in language she would never have used that she had reconsidered, that the marriage had been an impulsive error, that she was going to her cousin's family, and wished him released from any obligation. She looked up at him. "I did not write this," she said. The same expression crossed his face that had crossed it in the forecourt. Arrest, involuntary and unwilled. "Then show me," he said quietly, "what you did write." She turned into the office, opened the small locked drawer in the desk, and produced the letter she had kept for 3 years, the one in his hand which was also not his hand. If you have ever held 2 forged documents side by side and understood in a single moment the architecture of a betrayal, you know the silence that followed. A long one. Long enough that the inn bell rang somewhere above them, and neither moved. At last she said very quietly, "Your mother." He did not deny it. Something in him, some long-held arrangement of posture and discipline, went very slightly wrong at the edges. His wound surfaced then in a single low sentence. "I believed," he said, that you had found the marriage too costly once you had time to consider what you would be giving up. I had gone against every instruction my family gave me, and I believed I had done it for a woman who in the end made the practical calculation. He stopped. I have spent 3 years being angry at you for a decision you apparently did not make. She heard the grief under the anger. It had been there from the beginning. She understood now. He had not left. He had been left, as he understood it. He had walked into a November morning carrying the belief that the woman he married had weighed him against his family's disapproval and found the sum insufficient. She knew exactly what that belief felt like. She had lived inside its mirror image for 3 years. She did not touch him. She did not say anything generous or forgiving. Those were things for another hour when the present hour had been survived. The wedding, she said instead. He was silent a moment. Miss Price has done nothing wrong in this, he said, eventually. No, Cecily agreed. She has not. He left again without resolving anything because there was nothing to be resolved by 2 people alone in a small office, when the larger question required something the small office could not provide. The next morning arrived the way difficult mornings do, with perfect indifference to the condition of the people they find. Light came in through the casement windows of the kitchen passage. The smell of bread from the ovens reached the upper corridor. Horses were led out to the forecourt from the stable, their breath visible in the October cold. Cecily was in the kitchen conferring with the cook on the breakfast requirements when Lady Vane descended. She was a handsome woman in her middle 50s, upright in the manner of women who have never doubted their own rectitude and have found the posture comfortable. She wore deep green wool over a stiff bombazine, and the rings on her right hand caught the morning light with deliberate accuracy. She surveyed the kitchen passage, in the same way her son surveyed things, but where his was inventory, hers was assessment. I understand, Lady Vane said, addressing Cecily while appearing to address the middle distance, that the proprietress and my son have already become reacquainted. Cecily turned from the cook. Good morning, Lady Vane. Shall I have your breakfast brought to your room, or will you join the party in the dining room? My son has told me, Lady Vane said, who you are. I expect he has. You understand that nothing has changed. Her voice was pleasant, particular, calibrated to wound from within the range of courtesy. He is to be married this afternoon. Miss Price is an excellent match and a sensible young woman, and what occurred 3 years ago was, whatever its technical character, an arrangement that could not have stood. He was young. You were not a suitable wife. She paused. The innkeeper's widow, whatever her circumstances now, is not a suitable wife for the Viscount Vane. There it was, said in a private corridor, early morning, no witnesses but the cook, who had developed a sudden interest in his bread. Cecily looked at her. Your party will find the dining room prepared at 8, she said. I hope you enjoy your breakfast. She turned back to the cook. She heard Lady Vane leave. Miss Dorinda Price arrived that morning in a hired chaise from the village where she had spent the previous night with her mother, and she was exactly as Cecily might have designed her. If she had been asked to design someone, it would be impossible to resent. Composed, bright-eyed, genuinely kind in the small exchanges with servants and inn staff that people of rank often forget to manage, she thanked the ostler by name after learning it once. She admired the autumn elms along the forecourt lane with a simple and unperformed sincerity. She was 23 and had been told all her life that she was the correct choice for situations of this kind, and she had apparently believed it without becoming vain on the subject. She did not know about Cecily. Arthur came through the inn's main corridor at 10:30, and Cecily saw from the study window the moment he encountered Miss Price by the forecourt. Well, he was civil to her, gentle even, in the careful way of a man who has been told a woman is a good person, and has found no evidence to the contrary. There was no warmth in his face that resembled what had been in it the previous evening, when the forged letters lay on the desk between them. This was the warmth of duty. Miss Price deserved more than duty. Mrs. Alderton arrived before noon. She was a woman of Lady Vane's circle and vintage, a small-faced woman in aubergine silk who wore her social authority as visibly as her jewels and was rather less selective about deploying it. She stood at the inn's main entrance, being divested of her travel cloak by a parlor maid, and when Cecily passed through the hall to supervise the arrangement of the great room for the afternoon ceremony, Mrs. Alderton said, "Clearly enough for 3 guests in the hall to hear? Ah, is this the innkeeper's widow? How very resourceful to have a woman of that sort manage the arrangements." The 3 guests in the hall looked at Cecily. Cecily said pleasantly that she hoped Mrs. Alderton would find her rooms comfortable, and continued into the great room to ensure the flowers were placed correctly. The afternoon preparations occupied the hours before the ceremony. The great room had been dressed with white ribbon and late roses from the garden. The candles in their brass stands were lit at 2 o'clock. The wedding guests arranged themselves in the rows of chairs that had been brought from the village assembly rooms for the occasion. The local vicar, Mr. Tench, a round-shouldered man with a kind face and an awareness of the room's unusual significance, took his place at the front. Cecily remained in the corridor behind the great room, managing the final requirements of timing and arrangement from just outside the door. She had not decided by that point what she intended to do. She had thought of Mr. Riction. With Sefton and the marriage lines. She had thought of 3 years and a coin weight on a chain and the particular quality of Arthur's face when he said, "I believed you had left." Lady Vane found her at 2:30, in the short corridor between the great room and the kitchen passage. "He cannot go through with it, can he?" Cecily said before Lady Vane could speak. She was not certain where the sentence came from. "He will," Lady Vane said. Her voice was still pleasant. "He is a Vane. He understands what is required of him. Whatever the technical matter of those letters, the situation is what it has always been. You are the innkeeper's widow." She paused. "I am telling Miss Price now, so that she understands that there is no practical complication, only an inconvenient woman from his youth who had the misfortune to follow him here." She moved past Cecily toward the door where Miss Price stood waiting. Cecily stood in the corridor. She had known, coming into this morning, that she had no intention of making a scene. The marriage, if it went forward, might be legally problematic, the original ceremony having been performed and witnessed and recorded, and she had every reason to believe it had not been dissolved, but the discovery of that legal problem was a matter for solicitors and appropriate authorities. Not for a woman to announce from the doorway of a wedding ceremony she had herself arranged. She would leave. She would go to her rooms, instruct Mrs. Frame in the remaining management of the event, and travel to her solicitor in the morning. She would do it quietly, correctly, without scene or drama. She went upstairs, she went along the corridor, and then she stopped. The door to the room Lady Vane had taken as a private parlor was not fully closed. She had not been approaching it. She had been going past it toward the back stairs. The voice inside was carrying with the particular projection of a woman accustomed to being heard without effort. "He cannot want the innkeeper's widow," Lady Vane said. "Whatever the technical circumstances, whatever some solicitor from Bath imagines the documents establish. Arthur knows his duty. He has always known it." There was a murmur she could not distinguish, which was Miss Price's voice, low and careful. "You are an excellent match," Lady Vane said. "You have always been an excellent match. The family wants you. I want you. And a man of his station does not throw that over for a woman who has been managing a coaching inn." Cecily stood in the corridor and heard herself reduced to her category. A proprietress. An innkeeper's widow. A woman whose 3 years of work and loss were legible to Lady Vane only as social disqualification. The label had been spoken 3 times now. Each time with the same pleasant precision. Each time intended to arrive and settle like a stone in still water. She continued to the back stairs and went up. She was folding her wool coat across the small case she had laid on the bed when Mrs. Frame knocked, and opened the door without waiting, which was not her habit. "There is a Mr. Sefton, Mrs. Prosecte," Frame said, with the air of a woman, relaying information she does not entirely understand, "who has come to the tradesman's door and will not be moved. He says he has a matter of some urgency for the proprietress. He has papers. Cecily looked at her housekeeper. "Send him up," she said. Mr. Sefton was a thin man of 40, a solicitor from the town of Bath, who had, he explained, been in the employ of the late Mr. Coleman Pemberton in his later years, and had therefore had occasion to review the inn's legal documents in detail following the bequest. He had also been, before his current practice, a junior clerk to the firm that handled the Vane family's correspondence, and it was in that capacity, he said, settling himself in the chair she indicated, that he wished to speak to her. He had found, he said, in the course of settling a related estate matter, not 6 weeks prior, a copy of a letter in the Vane family archive. The letter was in the hand of Lady Vane's personal secretary. It was addressed to the postal relay that would have carried correspondence to Cecily at Ashmore Inn in November 3 years prior. It contained instructions for the delivery of a document to be conveyed as if from the inn to Lord Vane's address in London. He produced the copy. He also produced from the inner pocket of his coat a document of a different sort, the original marriage lines from the registry of the village of Frome, witnessed and signed by the vicar of St. Mary's and 2 parishioners, recording the lawful marriage of Arthur Henry Vane, Viscount Vane, and Cecily Margaret Hartwell, in October of the year in question. He had, he said, thought she might wish to have them. She sat with the documents for a moment. Below, she could hear the distant opening notes of the music that had been arranged for the ceremony's processional. "How much time do I have?" she said. "The ceremony began," Mr. Sefton said, checking his watch. "Approximately 3 minutes ago." She stood. She descended the stairs with no particular haste, because haste would suggest panic, and she was not panicking. She was the proprietress of Ashmore Inn. She knew every door in this building. She came through the small door at the side of the great room that was usually used by staff, and she stood at the back of the gathered guests. And she looked. The great room was candlelit and full of the scent of late roses. 40 chairs, 40 guests, Mr. Tench at the front with his prayer book, Miss Price in white, composed and lovely, Lady Vane in the front row, her spine very straight, and Arthur. He stood at the front of the room facing the vicar, and he was not moving the way a man moves when he is engaged in something. He was standing, the way a man stands when he is waiting for something to stop. His hands were at his sides. His face was averted slightly from Miss Price, toward the tall window on the north wall through which the October light came in at a flat, exposing angle. His jaw held its familiar tension. He looked, Cecily thought, like a man who had resolved to walk through a door he did not want to open. Mr. Tench said something. Arthur turned back toward the front of the room, and then from some quality of change in the room's atmosphere, or from something he had always been able to do in her presence, he turned again. He saw her. He did not look away. She held the documents in both hands and looked at him across the room. Across 40 guests and the scent of late roses, and 3 years of what they had each been made to believe about the other, the vicar said something else. Arthur did not respond. Lady Vane turned, following her son's gaze, and went very still. Arthur moved. He did not run. He walked, which was somehow more deliberate, more irreversible. Each step an announced intention crossing the length of the great room, in a silence that had gathered itself from somewhere and settled over the guests and the candles and the late roses with the weight of a held breath. The distance was not great, 30 feet perhaps, and he covered it slowly, which made it feel like a public act rather than a private one, which was, Cecily understood, exactly what it was meant to be. She watched him come. She did not move toward him. She stood in the doorway of the great room of Ashmore Inn, the inn that was hers, the building she had made into something by 3 years of ordinary courage, and she held the marriage lines in both hands and watched the man who had once left, who had been made to believe she had left, walk across a candlelit room to correct the error. He passed the rows of chairs, and the guests in them turned as he passed, the way a crowd turns when it understands that the thing it came to witness is not the thing that is happening. He passed Mrs. Alderton, whose mouth had opened and closed. He passed his mother, who said in a voice barely above a whisper, his name, just his name, with all the history that name carried in her mouth. And he did not stop. He stopped in front of Cecily. He looked at the documents in her hands. He looked at her face. He turned. "Doe," he said, into the candlelit room, into the silence of 40 people who had stopped breathing, at precisely the same moment, into the specific quality of arrested time that surrounds an irrevocable act. "Cecily is my wife. She has always been my wife." The silence held for one more beat. Then from somewhere in the room a guest drew a long breath. Lady Vane's fan, which she had been holding at its characteristic measured height, descended. Miss Price looked at Cecily. Her expression was one of the most composed pieces of work Cecily had ever witnessed on a human face. Grief and pride, and the quick, dignified retreat of a woman who knew when a situation had resolved itself past her ability to contest it. She turned to her mother, who had risen, and she said something low and brief, and the two of them moved toward the side door with a grace that would cost them both something later, in private, but was exactly right for now. Cecily would think of Miss Price for a long time after this morning with a specific respect. Mr. Tench closed his prayer book. He looked at Arthur. He looked at Cecily. He said mildly that he supposed this resolved the question of the ceremony. Lady Vane did not fragment. She was too composed for that. When she rose and turned, the certainty she had carried as naturally as posture was gone from her face, replaced by something older and less practiced, the expression of a woman whose calculations had arrived for the first time at a figure she did not anticipate. "Arthur," she said. "Not now, Mother," he said quietly. Without cruelty. With the particular finality of a man who has made a decision and understands that it is permanent. Sefton, from somewhere slightly behind Cecily, produced his watch again and examined it with the air of a man whose errand has concluded. The guests departed the great room in the way that wedding guests depart rooms when the ceremony they expected has been replaced by a different ceremony entirely. They departed in small groups, subdued, with the particular confusion of people who have witnessed history and are not certain yet how to discuss it. Lady Vane remained until only the three of them were left in the great room. She looked at Cecily, at last with a directness she had not managed before. "I was wrong," she said very quietly, "about what he needed. I was not wrong about what I wanted for him." It was the nearest she would come to acknowledgement. Cecily received it with a stillness that was not coldness, only the appropriate gravity of the moment. Lady Vane left. Cecily and Arthur stood in the great room of Ashmore Inn alone, the candles still burning, the late roses already losing petals in the warmth, the October afternoon visible through the tall north window. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. "I kept the letter," he said eventually, "the forged one, for 3 years. As evidence of what it felt like to be wrong about someone, I kept yours," she said. "For the same reason." He reached out and took the marriage lines from her hands, not the forged letter but the original document, the names and the date and the vicar's signature. He looked at it. He folded it carefully and placed it in his breast pocket in the same place where the forged letter had lived. He said her name. Her given name said in his voice, which she had not heard in 3 years, which she recognized precisely, which struck the particular note her body had apparently kept catalogued and ready. "Cecily." She could not answer immediately. "Yes," she said when she could. "All right, yes." He did not reach for her immediately, nor she for him. They stood a moment longer, in the great room's candlelight, in the quiet that follows the resolution of something that has been wrong for too long, in the autumn light coming through the north window. Outside, the October elms along the lane had turned fully to copper and amber and gold. By evening the inn had settled. The wedding party's guests had dispersed or retired to their rooms, some relieved, some perplexed. Mrs. Alderton, already composing, Cecily suspected, the version of events she would carry back to London. Lady Vane had taken supper in her room, and departed by hired chaise before 6, sending up a note that was brief and without apology, but that Cecily thought, on second reading, contained the faint outlines of one. Cecily sat in the small parlor behind the kitchen passage, the room she had used as her office for 2 years, and her private sitting room before that, the fire lit against the October evening. The room smelled of wood smoke and paper, and the specific autumn cold coming in under the ill-fitting window frame she had meant to have caulked in September. Arthur sat across from her, his coat exchanged for his shirt sleeves. A cup of tea cooling on the table at his elbow. She was not wearing the proprietress's dark wool. She had changed, after the guests were seen to and the inn's evening routine set in motion, and the fires built up and the remaining guests settled into the gray wool she wore in the evenings, the one that was softer and older and did not announce anything. The gray wool was the one Mr. Pemberton had said suited her best. That first autumn, when she had no good clothes, and he had asked Mrs. Frame to see what could be found in the village, it was the wool of a woman who had stopped performing adequacy and simply been adequate, and it fit her better than the proprietress's dark blue ever quite had. She reached to the chain at her throat which she wore under her dress and had done since the 2nd month after her arrival, when Mr. Clast Pemberton had pressed it into her hand in the kitchen and told her that the coin weights were the first thing he had bought for the inn when he opened it, and that they had always brought him luck and that she might find she needed some. The chain held a small coin weight from the inn's scales, brass, worn smooth on one side from the years of handling. She had reached for it in difficult moments for 2 years and found it steady. She drew it out now and looked at it in the firelight. Arthur was watching her. "He gave it to me," she said. "Mr. Pemberton." In the first weeks, Arthur looked at the small coin weight at her hands holding it. "He knew what you were," he said. Immediately. "He was a perceptive man," she said. A quiet fell between them that was not, for the first time in 2 days, the quiet of withheld things. Outside, the October wind moved through the elms, and somewhere in the inn above them, a door was opened and closed, and the fire settled, and the evening continued. "This is our home," he said. She considered the sentence. The inn, its beams, its stone, its kitchen and accounts and stable yard. 3 years of her labor, in its walls, in its floors, in the rebuilt kitchen garden and the newly painted sign above the door. "Yes," she said. "It always was." She held the coin weight in her palm, the brass warm from her hand, and the fire burned, and outside the copper elms held the last of the daylight. If this story has held you to its end, you are the kind of listener this narrator lives to find. Take a moment, if you will, and leave a thought below, or stay close for what comes next. Either way, the warmth remains. The inn sign turned gently in the October wind, and the first candle in the upstairs window was lit by a sleepy parlor maid who would tell the story for years, and Cecily sat in the firelight of Ashmore Inn, with the brass coin weight warm in her hand. Home